Hello, and welcome to The Smiling Human, where collectively we evolve through inquiry. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Smiling Human podcast. My name is Oak Mountain, and I'm your host. This episode is a little different than the other ones, as this is a monologue episode where I attempt to distill and summarize the wisdom that was captured in the prior 3 interviews. These being with Dolphin Casper, Michael Bates, and Deus Fortier, all exploring meaning and the masculine. I hope you enjoy. Fantastic. So, as this is slightly different in terms of the format from our previous episodes, I thought it would be prudent to introduce the topic or thesis for this episode, and that is, how can modern men navigate the complexities of masculinity and societal expectations to foster personal growth, meaningful relationships, and societal harmony? Now, in order to answer such a big question, I have, let's say, 6 guideposts for this episode. And I have generated these guideposts based off of the conversations of the previous guests, those being Dolphin Casper, Michael Bates, and Deus Fortier. Now, for those who've listened to all of those episodes, these topics will not be unfamiliar. And for those who haven't, well, I'm sure you will glean value nonetheless. Without further ado, the first question I'd like to address today is, how can modern initiation rituals be adapted to suit contemporary society? One of the biggest questions that comes around when we're looking at ritual or rites of passage is the idea of purpose. Why is it that we had rites of passage or rituals, and what is it about them that makes them necessary for men in particular? Well, before we look at the ancient rituals, I think it would be prudent to look at our current rituals or rites of passage, should we even be able to say we have any in modern society. Looking back at my own life, I can note a few culturally instantiated rites of passage as a man. This being the acquisition of a driver's license or a learner's license, along with that, the purchasing of one's first car, the first sexual engagement or the loss of virginity, first job, moving out of home, the graduating of high school or a post-secondary institution, marriage. Although not all of these are exclusive to men, growing up in Canada in the 90s and the early 2000s, this was what I was looking for, what I had anticipated as my inherited rites of passage. And so if we look at these individually, we might be able to uncover why the ancient traditions are so valuable, at least why they might be valuable insofar as we can bring them into the present. So let's look then. The acquisition of a driver's license. What does this really represent? It's not that we need this article of government-issued ID. It's not the object itself. Obviously, it is a symbol of something else. It's a symbol of, well, first of all, competency. I am able to operate a motor vehicle. This competency is then also a mark of maturation. I have mastered my body, my mind well enough to be able to pass a series of tests, which is a mark of ritual and initiation, such that I have been permitted by an authority, be it the government in this case, or perhaps previously father or tribe, to partake in what might be a dangerous responsibility, the operating of a motor vehicle. Secondarily, it is an expression of freedom. One can move at one's own will and is no longer bound by the rigor or regulations of the family unit. I can get in a car, I can go see my friends, I can go and do these things, presuming we have our own. And so the note around this is that we can distill out, at least from this one example, and we'll look at a few more, that there are presuppositions of value inside of these Western modern rituals or rites of passage. We value competency, we value maturation, we value achievement, which is the passage of the test, and we value freedom and autonomy, all of which are acquired in this first particular example. I think that the purchasing of a car is probably quite similar. We don't need to go fully into the acquisition in that aspect. Although I will make one point of note, which is to say the presupposition of value points us, when I'm speaking specifically to buying a new car, towards the idea of material wealth. And this is a bit of foreshadowing, because as we get further into this discussion, that the acquisition of material wealth is in some sense an instantiation of the capacity to provide. The ability to obtain something of value is a mark of competency and a mark of maturation. So that reiterates it in that sense. In the other sense, we have at least two other points within this developmental trajectory that are relational, exclusively relational. And this is the mark of the first sexual experience and the mark of matrimony, or taking a lifelong mate. Why this is seen as a rites of passage is because, and rightfully so, boys don't have sex. Men have sex. Boys don't father children. Men father children. And there's, unfortunately, a gray area in our current society where we do have boys and girls engaging in all sorts of sexual activities that may be very well beyond what their psychology is capable of integrating in a meaningful and grounded way. So perhaps you are of the same ilk in recognizing, perhaps intuitively, that there is a distinction there, that sexual maturity is one element of the maturation of the psyche of men. It marks as well, when one has this sexual encounter or is capable of finding a lifelong mate, that the masculine essence, the value of that being, is recognized and selected. And again, this is a test in some sense, because when we are inside of our familial units, what do we have but the unconditional love and support of the women around us, be it our mothers, our sisters, our aunts, the collective kin or tribe. But when we start to have this burgeoning exploration into the sexual dichotomy and sexual exploration with the opposite sex, what we find is the exclusively conditional aspect of the other. That is to say, we move as a part of the development from boy to man, from relating with the feminine as an expression of unconditional love and acceptance to the feminine as exclusively conditional in terms of its acceptance and its love. And the way that the internal system of the boy or the young man integrates that change, I believe, is one of the valuable marks of that particular rites of passage. And for those who haven't already heard it, my conversation with Michael Bates touches on this in depth, and as well as my conversation with Deus Fortier as we speak about sexual maturation for men. So that's a very powerful piece. Now, although it is not exhaustive for our modern expressions of rites of passage, I think at this point it would be prudent to look at some of the ancient rituals. And this is not going to be an exhaustive list of ancient indigenous practices or wisdom traditions that have brought boys to men, because we would be here for several episodes and perhaps several days. What I will say is that one thing that all of these ancient rituals had in common is they serve the purpose to transform the psyche. That is to say that the one who enters into the ritual is not the one who leaves it. There is something fundamental, transformational, and almost alchemical, if you would grant me that, in the process of this rites of passage. What is it that one gains, or what is it that one loses as a boy to become a man? Well, I'm reminded of the works of Robert Moore and his associate, I can't remember his first name, Gillette, I believe is the last name, in King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, as well as in Iron John. And these ideas that even in the grandest and broadest sense of the mythos, that we lose aspects of our boyhood in order to become a man. That loss is one that induces fear. It can be scary. Sometimes it's marked physically by scarring, the losing of perfection of the body, tattooing, the chopping of hair, or the removal of a tooth, as an example. And what is it then that it is exchanged for? What is this boyhood, this dependency, this lack of maturation exchanged for when one passes through this gate in terms of the transformation of the psyche via a rites of passage? As far as I can see it, there is an undergoing of preparation that these rites mark. That boys, as they are prepared for manhood, are being prepared for a role and a set of responsibilities that are necessary for the thriving of their community. That is to say that if it were not for these rites of passage, and only boys made it into adulthood having never been prepared for these roles, that the structure and functioning of the family unit, of the tribe, of their social dynamics as a whole would be compromised. That there is in fact something necessary about the death of the boy and the birth of the man that allows for a supported, strong, and sustainable social dynamic to flourish. This points us to the need, the necessity for such an initiation, and what we might notice as being a great chasm in our current cultural ethos. That is to say, there are many boys in men's bodies, we could say. There are many adult boys moving around on this planet, men who were never initiated, whose fathers were never initiated, whose grandfathers were never initiated into a meaningful place amongst peers and in their society, and thus lived lives untethered and unrooted from a meaningful trajectory towards fulfillment, as well as untethered from relationships that would be informative at a base psychological and soul level. So what then? What then are the key components of healthy masculinity in today's world? What is it that we might find moving through these rites of passage, moving through these initiation rituals? Well, this is a hot button issue, to be sure. The ideas of toxicity in both masculinity and femininity are all over social media and constantly finding themselves brought to the surface and highlighted as dangers or things to be scorned and shunned. Well, there's a potency that is evoked by these rituals, and I use the word potency very deliberately. If we look at the other side of potency, particularly when we speak about men, impotent. Need I say more? We know that there's a great deal of shame, perhaps, or a great deal of shrinking away, pun intended, when that moniker, impotent, is levied towards a man. And yet potency is not just force. It's not just domination. It's not just the capacity to overcome. Potency speaks more to the quality that underlies action than it does the action itself. And we might look at how, then, our masculine potency can be transmitted or expressed through action. And this is where I draw on the world of archetype. And for those unfamiliar, archetype is, or an archetype, archetypes, come from the work of Carl Jung. And this is not a verbatim list of Jung's work. This is something that I've concocted together through my own readings and my own practices. And these are archetypes that I've also had the privilege of bringing into transformational workshops, working with a man named Wesley Jobe out on Vancouver Island. We do transformational and somatic men's breathwork events exploring these. And if you're curious about that, you can find more information in the description below. So these archetypes, some that come to mind when we speak about men: the provider, the protector, a guide, a leader, maybe someone who is strong, striving, capable, virtuous, and responsible. Now, I recognize that not all of those are archetypal. However, they are characteristic, and it's important to look at how is it that this power and potency that comes through this initiation can be expressed, and these archetypes and characteristics can serve as a guide. The provider is a very traditional sense of the masculine. What is it that a man is meant to provide? Well, I'm not going to sit here and give you a dissertation on that. I would encourage you as the listener, as a curious thinker, as someone active in their own development, to really begin to question, and not in a way of undermining, but in the manner of uncovering. If you are a man, what are you meant to provide? What do you provide, and for whom? What is your means of provision? Perhaps the first thing that comes to mind is finances, money, cash. Well, this is but a symbol of value. Money only allows us to get those things that are life-affirming, life-preserving: food, shelter, medicine, and the like. And so the capacity to provide is, at its core, the capacity to support the flourishing and growth of things that live. This is what we provide. We provide that which is life-affirming and life-supporting. Perhaps this will broaden our picture. In the same vein, the protector is not protecting the unvaluable, things that we are disinterested in, or things that hold no merit or concern, but exactly the opposite. The energy of the protector is not only one who is willing to stand up and to protect, but also has the capability and the discernment to recognize what is valuable inherently. That recognition is only one half of the puzzle. The other piece, as previously mentioned, is the willingness and strength to act in protection of that which is valuable. And by our previous explorations of the provider, we can see too that that which is valuable is life-affirming. It is life-supporting. We might say that this is our resources at a very fundamental sense: protect the food, protect the water, protect the lands that provide it, that house and home our more than human kin, to protect the innocent, to protect the truth, to protect the structures that allow for the healthy flourishing of children and societies and relationships. These are all aspects and expressions of the protector. But we can look out at our world currently, and maybe you see this, maybe you don't, but I know I sure do. I see what seems to be, in some circles, a railing against or a rising against this natural masculine inclination. That there are those who say we need not be protected. We might know the saying, "I don't need no man," as we might have heard before, and we need only spend a short period of time on something like TikTok or YouTube Shorts to see that there are plenty of people out there who genuinely believe that men are not necessary, that this intrinsic drive to protect and provide is not necessary. And this points us to a shift in societal expectations. And I don't want to offer the imposition that these expectations are universal or unilateral or even popular, but they are present. And so we might ask ourselves then, how is it that men can balance these more traditional or even ancestral masculine roles with these evolving societal expectations? It's a fantastic and potent question for all men. And one of the pieces that comes to mind initially is a part of the conversation I had with Dolphin Casper in episode 1. And something that Dolphin said, I'll paraphrase here. He said, "Now more than ever, men are able to do what women have done, and women are able to do what men have done." And it was Dolphin's disposition that this was a net good for us as society. And I think that inherently there is no wrong or harm in the availability for men or women to inhabit the previously exclusive roles of the other. Inherently, I don't think there's any harm in this. However, one thing comes to mind that I wanted to share here and emphasize, which is the need for those roles to be occupied and the capacity that occupying those roles requires, and the consequences of occupying those roles for society are all still necessary. That is to say, if one moves away, if a man moves away from a role that would have been his, then that creates a space that needs to be filled socially. That if it goes unfilled, we find a lack of stability, we find a lack of consistency, a lack of sustainability in terms of relationships and societal strength. That is not to imply, though, that every time a man does something traditionally feminine or that a woman does something traditionally masculine, that there's a vacuum created that is undermining the strength of society. This is not what I mean to say. But rather, that weight that would have been carried by the individual needs to be carried and will necessarily have to be carried by someone else. And this is why we see the shifting in polarities. More women moving into the education sphere, which was typically dominated and historically dominated by men. More women CEOs moving into high-performing career paths. Less women, and men for that matter, having families. All of this is a shift in polarity, a masculinization of the feminine. And in equal kind, we see the feminization of men. We don't see the kind of strength, valor, respect, and chivalry that once was the dominant current in our culture. Is this a direct expression of the feminization of men? At least in part, I would say yes. And for those listening, I would assume you recognize that this is not by any means a demonization of that which is feminine. It is just a recognition that when the poles shift, balance will need to be found. And how that is found will look differently, but it will definitely, however it is found, have an impact on our social structure. There are core energies at play in society, psychologically, spiritually, and in relationships. And in order to balance this inherent drive that many men have to be the protector, to be the provider, to be the one that is a leader who is virtuous, responsible, admired, and respected, what we need to recognize is the necessity of insight. And what do I mean by this? Insight takes us from ignorance into knowledge, and perhaps into wisdom. And so I would invite you, to the listener, be ye male or female, to have a look around. Have a look around at your own life, at your relationships, at society, at your work, and notice where your expression of masculinity is showing up. Where is it active? Where is it needed? And what is it that is innate to you that drives this compulsion? What is it that you can provide in those spaces? This runs along the same current as a quote from one of Jordan Peterson's book. I believe it's the 12 Rules for Life, the first one, where he encourages those to look to where responsibility is being abdicated, because there is a potency in that space. And when we have this neutralization, this androgenization of the spirit of humankind, we do, as a consequence, find ourselves faced with the abdication of responsibility. These responsibilities would be the ones that we would have been prepared for, at least in some sense. Although our current state is different, it is not that we are operating in the same ancestral spaces, and the needs are in fact different, but the need for your capacity, the need for your insightfulness, for your virtue, for your strength, that has not changed. What has changed is where and how that can be provided. And so once again, where is it that your masculine essence is active? What is it that you can provide? And who and how are you responsible for leading? As the first half of our show sets in, I wanted to thank you for listening to the Smiling Human podcast. This show would not be possible without the support of listeners like you. Liking and following on YouTube, sharing with a friend, or following on your local podcast app are all easy and simple ways that you can support this show and help it grow into the future. If you do want to support this show directly, you can consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. Patrons get perks like early access to all episodes, behind-the-scenes content, and access to live Q&As with me. If this feels within your means, then please consider becoming a patron. Now let's get back to the show. Those invitations to look around you and to tune in to what it is that you can bring and what it is that you are bringing are all rooted in curiosity. And curiosity came up in the conversation with Dolphin Casper and the role of curiosity. And I wanted to use this as a bridge to investigate how curiosity can be used as a tool to deepen connections and to understand diverse perspectives. Now, I'll caveat this by saying the capacity to understand diverse perspectives and to engage and foster deep connections might be an expression of our responsibilities as men. That there is little good done by the boy or the tyrant who locks himself in a castle alone with his own thoughts. That being open and receptive and willing to receive new information and to be changed by that is in fact a balanced expression, not just of masculinity, but of humanity as a whole. What I mean by that is curiosity depends on an openness to the world, an openness to others, to new ideas, and a willingness to actively seek that. And this is a beautiful balance of the yin and yang principles, the principle of receptivity and the principle of action in acquisition. When I note the responsibility of being open to diverse perspectives, what I'm drawing towards is the responsibility of transformation. And these questions that we explored earlier, what is my masculinity providing? Who and how am I responsible for leading, as an example? These are invitations. An invitation based on the idea that how you are right now, or how I am right now as a man, is not complete. And not in a sense that you're not whole, but there is rather room to grow always. And that this room for growth and that space where we end up when we grow is more valuable than where we are now. And I want to note that it's important to distinguish that I'm not saying you as a man are not valuable, that you do not have worth, because there's a difference between worth and worthiness. Worthiness is your inherent characteristic to be deserving of love, respect, kindness, etc. But worth is a measure of value, and we can measure the value of action. And we can measure the value of the action of a man by the quality of the consequences that follow from those actions. And thus, if you look around you and you notice that your expression of provision or protection are underactive, then we can say there's a more valuable expression to be found, to be developed, to be had. To embody such an expression is to recognize the necessity of bringing value. That is to say that it is inherent in us to be capable of bringing value, and it is incumbent upon us to bring forward the greatest value that we can into the world. And thus, by recognizing our room for growth, recognizing the capacity our mind, body, and soul has for transformation, and taking action thereon, we are now active in actioning that responsibility, in fulfilling that responsibility. Insofar as this relates to deep connections, we as men do not exist in isolation. As noted at several junctures in the first half of this episode, we are a part of relationships, be they with mates, with family. We serve a role in companies, in society, and in the world as a whole. And thus the capacity to relate is an expression of capability. And what do I mean by this? Well, a degree of humility is needed when we're on this journey towards the development and application of matured masculinity. And it requires us to not only recognize who we are, how we are, and where we are now, but also where we could be, who we could be, and how we could be. And one of the things that I find so deeply valuable about relationships, about connections, kinship, friendship, is that these are means by which we come to know ourselves more deeply. We will find parts of ourselves, parts of our masculinity, parts of our joy, parts of our sorrow, perhaps, compassion, and the like, when we connect with others. And curiosity opens us to these connections that can be so deeply transformative by saying, I don't really know what's going on, but I want to know, and I can know, so I'm going to do something about knowing. And thus, when we lean into the opportunity, we lean into the chance to learn about another, what we're doing is we are maintaining a degree of valuable spaciousness internally that is based on humility, that is based on curiosity, that allows for the information, deeply authentic in another, to come forward, almost like an invitation or an evocation, such that both parties can be transformed. What is it about the masculine uniquely that allows this to happen? Well, the masculine's gift is presence. Some might say that it is space holding. It is the one that brings forward the container. And if we look at this, then we can recognize that curiosity creates a safe container, particularly because curiosity is non-judgmental. Curiosity is, in fact, a recognition of ignorance and a willingness to be changed and to learn. And so when curiosity underlies the expression of masculine presence, there is a warmth and spaciousness that surrounds and envelops any and all that are welcomed into that. And that is deeply profound and fundamentally transformative. This allows for not only insights into other, but also insights into self, because the boundaries between self and other, when we are engaged in this curious and humble presence, start to fade away. And we can start to see parts of ourselves in the other. We can be informed. And this is why I emphasize the necessity and the potency of men's groups and men's work. There's a saying you might be familiar with: iron sharpens iron. That is to say that our capacity to transform, to alchemize these heavier, duller parts of our masculinity are fortified and catalyzed in the presence of other men. That there is something unique, potent, and unattainable outside of these masculine spaces that, when applied, sought, and cherished meaningfully, brings forward the kind of transformation made possible by those rites of passage mentioned earlier. It should be noted that the rites of passage for men are done by men. And I talked to Michael about this in episode 2. It's a fun saying that mothers make boys and fathers make men. And this is an important piece to recognize, that when we are to move into our fullest expression of masculinity, it requires the presence of others. Those who have gone before us, those who have explored and wayfared the terrain that they then invite us into. And this brings me to the second to last question that I'd like to explore in today's episode, which is, how can we draw inspiration from the highest expressions of masculinity in order to influence our personal development? Well, just like curiosity recognizes that there is an absence of information and a willingness to attain that information, we can take it one step further. The journey to the value that curiosity recognizes or intuits to be there is a journey that requires orientation. It's a journey that requires aim. That is to say, if you are to go searching for gold, or a hero's quest, or even to find berries in the forest, you have to have some sense of where you're going. And that sense of where you're going can be inherently informed by those who have been there before. Forgive me for stating the obvious, but it is imperative to recognize the value of the men and the traditions that have come before, such that they can, despite the contexts being different, inform us as to a meaningful way of aiming or striving towards these greater expressions of masculine development. Speaking to the necessity of aim, it also speaks to the inherent quality of striving that I see in the masculine spirit. We call them go-getters, perhaps, or those who are motivated, who are capable, who are active in this getting energy. And there's nothing to be said about the getting of material here, because it's not a book or literal gold or a prize atop a hill or a crown or a woman that is attained here. Rather, it is the gold of the spirit that is obtained through and only through following this meaningful trajectory towards wisdom. And it is towards wisdom, because knowledge is a data set. Knowledge is ideas. Knowledge is information, accurate and true information. But wisdom is that information instilled with a spirit that understands applicability, it understands context, and it understands why that information is important and meaningful. And the only way that we come by this wisdom is through the trials and tribulations birthed along this journey. Now, some of you might be saying, he hasn't said anything about the hero's journey yet. Why hasn't he mentioned the hero's journey? Well, here's a powerful piece for you. The hero's journey is a boy's journey. It's not a man's journey. And this is one that is often misconstrued in common parlance, where we talk about men, being on the hero's journey. Oh, the hero's journey. The hero of 1,000 faces. God bless Joseph Campbell. God bless Carl Jung. Thank you for this information. But, and here's the rub, the hero's journey is the means by which the boy becomes a man. And when the boy becomes a man, the hero is home. He has become the hero. And this is the key piece to recognize, that we're not walking this with our matured masculine pieces. We walk the hero's journey with those parts of ourselves that have not yet been initiated. And we look to the heroes of old. We look to the myths of antiquity. We look to the wisdom traditions of the indigenous worldwide and ask, how can these disparate parts of myself finally come into integrity and wholeness such that I need not be on the hero's journey anymore, and I can take up my rightful throne, that is the kingdom of my manhood, and bring forward the richness therein into my relationships, into the society that I find myself in, and fill the roles that I am given and fulfill the responsibilities that I have with that same richness that is gained from this maturative process. It's not an easy one, obviously, and it's not simple either, but there is the necessity for this, particularly because of this androgenization or this polarity shift that's undergone in society. And what's so bloody ironic about this is that we have a decrease in polarization between men and women, and yet we have an increase in polarization between the attitudes that find themselves expressed culturally. There's this divide people talk about, the divide of people, the gender wars, or the battle of the sexes, this type of idea that men and women are becoming further and further apart and are struggling more and more to understand one another. And so the final question that I'll put forward today is, what can we do to overcome these societal divisions and polarizations, particularly as men? First off, I want to caveat that there is a risk. There's a risk to polarizing into the masculine. There's a risk to expressing your masculine essence in this world. There's a risk to embodying and expressing these powerful parts of you, or these non-matured parts of you, or these ragged and rough and unforeseen shadow parts of you. There's always a risk. The risk is, if done with force, then the good that could come will be lost to the damage that follows. And I want to draw a distinction here between power and force. Power is a natural phenomenon. Power is, in some senses, non-distinct from life. The ability and the natural essence that moves atoms, that builds stars, that has the intelligence to maintain all of your metabolic functions and the order of all creation that is present in you here and now, that's power. Force is more of a push. There's resistance. There is a lack of wholeness. There is one acting against the other. It's based in separation, where power is in alignment with wholeness, the implicit wholeness of you and of creation. And so when I say there's a risk to this expression of masculinity, I have seen what happens when men force what they believe and perceive to be a quote unquote pure expression of masculinity out into the world. There's rigidity, there's ossification, there's a lack of adaptation, and there's an unwillingness to waver from what has been declared to be a fundamental or axiomatic truth of manhood and humanness. If one is incapable of adaptation, you do not survive. And rigidity is not an expression of matured masculinity. In fact, it is more akin to a tyrant or a young boy or a toddler, for those who have kids, nieces and nephews, in the 2 to 3 range. We know what that rigidity is like. No, and there's no way you can make me. That's the spirit of it. Not only this, but there can be condemnation, a judgment towards the idea that anybody else's perspective is wrong. And this harkens back. This harkens back to curiosity as a necessary underlying factor for this maturation process. And the more we align ourselves with this transformative power, then the division inside of ourselves that creates self and other, in and out, begins to fall away. And when it falls away inside, then that same dissolution will be found externally. What would it be like, imagine for a moment, what would it be like to live in a world where all those who inhabit their roles in society recognize the inherent wholeness of themselves, that recognize the inherent wholeness in another, that recognize that the difference between men and women, between masculine and feminine, is not one of division, but one of balance. That is something that we can do internally, that you can do internally by maintaining a clear aim and an open and curious heart and mind. And this takes me to what I will close on today. And it's a quote that I pitched to Michael. And we spoke about it in the conversation in episode 2, and we also spoke about it on his Remasculation podcast, which you should check out if you haven't already heard. And that's the idea that your masculinity develops as your present moment awareness develops. That is to say, the nexus for all growth, for all transformation, for all communion with meaning is present moment awareness. And although we can populate this present moment with curiosities about the future, with reflections and insights on the past, inhabiting this moment is the most courageous, the most powerful thing that you can do as a man if you desire to bring forward the kind of change and potency that you believe to be possible within your soul. And with that, dear listener, we've come to a close. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Smiling Human podcast. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing on YouTube or giving a follow on your local podcast app. I know I said it in the mid-roll, but I'll say it again. If you'd like to support this show directly, you can do so at patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. You'll gain access to perks like early access to episodes, behind-the-scenes content, as well as access to live Q&As. Also, I've just produced an insight journal and I want to give it to you for free. You can find access to this month-long personal development journal in the link below. This is in the show notes or in the YouTube description. Also, if you feel inspired by the sharing that has taken place in conversations like this and you want to work with me directly, you can find a link to a free call below. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you again.